This is PowerPoint Lecture 2.2 on the origins of the American Empire. We start by establishing the imperialist tradition of the United States. One of the things we dispel here is we dispel the idea that the United States was isolationistic. Okay, we had the early Indian Wars of the colonial period, the Pequot War, and King Philip's War in New England. We have the Powhatan War in Virginia. We then have the War of 1812, which is the United States attempt to dominate Canada and boot the British out of there. This is derived from Manifest Destiny, the idea that it was almost a providentially arranged or a providential destiny for the United States to dominate North America. And then finally, from the preceding epoch in Lecture 5, we have the Sioux Indian Wars of the late 19th century. For the most part, what we want to establish is an economic basis for the development of this empire. And without getting into the detail too much, what the United States was seeking was a kind of neo-mercantilism. In U.S. History 1, we talk at some length and spend some time on the idea of a mercantilistic or a mercantilism system of economics in the colonial period, where you have these core actors, which at that point were the European powers, and their subsidiary colonies or their subordinate colonies, which provide raw materials. So this is what the United States is looking for. Primarily where they're going to look for it is Latin America and the Far East, most notably China. They'll also make inroads, as you see Perry's expedition to Japan. This will be at the middle of the 19th century, and this is the stuff that lays the groundwork for an outstanding film with Tom Cruise called The Last Samurai. Now, the reason behind this, we want to keep in the back of our minds as we go through this, is that while this is going on, what do we have happening internally in the United States, particularly in the economic sector? Well, primarily what you have going on is a massive expansion of the manufacturing sector, okay, which will be one of the contributory causes and ultimately culminate in the economic crisis of 1892, which was the climax of Epoch 1. Well, that's kind of the background now that we set up for the development of Epoch 2, and particularly, specifically for the development of this American empire. We first set the foundations for this with the very famous, what was referred to as Seward's Icebox. Seward was the Secretary of State under Lincoln, and with Lincoln's approval, he made a very controversial decision in purchasing Alaska for, as you see, $7.2 million from Russia, which was really the beginning of the territorial expansion. And it was highly criticized because it's Alaska. Alaska was seen by the United States, by the average American citizen, as kind of a frozen wasteland. We will also have, during this period, the occupation of Midway Island, and we'll discuss Hawaii in just a second. But what the United States needs, we want to understand, is this. The United States is attempting to make inroads to trade with China, and we'll deal with that specifically in a moment. Okay? In order to be able to do that, the United States has to be able to project both force and commercial interests across the Pacific Ocean to get to the Far East. In order to do that, you need coaling stations. Okay? You need waypoints along the way where you can stockpile resources to refuel the fleet. This is at a time prior to the gasoline engine. And so what you've got is you've got ships running on coal, and so you need coaling stations. Midway Island, a classic example. Hawaii will be an example of this. Okay, ultimately, when we get to the Spanish-American War, this is one of the motivations for taking the Philippines. All of these are designed to act as stepping stones to Asia for the United States. The second thing we want to talk about with the latter 19th century foundations of this is the first Pan-American Union, which was a conference set up by Blaine, who was Secretary of State under Garfield and Harrison. And the ultimate purpose of this was to try to create a trade union throughout the Western Hemisphere. That would be the Middle Americas and South America, And of course, the United States, being the most dominant economic power among them in the Western Hemisphere, would of course dominate this. Now we get specifically to the open door policy towards China. Now, we want to just lay a smallish amount of background behind this. By the early 19th century, China was a subordinated entity, okay? It had been subdivided by the European powers, who had a technological superiority over the Chinese, and therefore they were able to dominate the Chinese, okay? And they had divided it into spheres of influence. This would be all of the European powers, Germany, Holland, at the time Prussia, but ultimately it will be inherited by the Germans in the late 19th century. Britain, France are the principal two players, and the United States is locked out of this. Why is the United States locked out of this? Well, primarily because if we recall correctly, throughout the 19th century, the United States its concerns with the Far East are palpable, they're there, but really their concern is spreading across the American continent. So while the United States is busying itself crawling across the North American continent, the Europeans are divvying up China. So the U.S. will seek not a sphere of influence in China, because they're not going to be able to get it. They'd have to unseat European powers, which would involve them potentially in European conflict. Instead, they seek an open door policy where, okay, the Europeans will have all of the spheres of influence in China, but they will allow free trade with the United States. This will be, actually, as it works out, an unsuccessful undertaking for the United States. The United States will never obtain a free trade agreement with the European powers vis-a-vis or in regards to their spheres of influence in China. Now, along with this in China, we also have a couple of other developments. For example, we have the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. Now, I made reference to the movie with Tom Cruise, The Last Samurai. The Last Samurai takes place about 10 years, give or take, prior to the Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese, when they met the Americans, realized, and they kind of knew this before, that technologically and politically, they were still existing in the 14th century. They were no match for the European powers. They weren't really even a match for the Chinese. And so they begin to court the Americans in an effort to develop, more than anything else, an industrial base and military, which they will ultimately very successfully do. In fact, from the time they start that, if we put mid-1880s, it'll be about 50 years later that they conquer China and initiate the Second World War in the Pacific. So that's going to be something that comes back to bite the Americans when the Americans give military assistance to the Japanese in the late 19th century and help to develop the Japanese military. It's going to come back to kind of bite them in the ass, so to speak. But that's one of the things in American foreign policy we go over, is that American foreign policy has a tendency to suffer from a certain myopia, meaning that it's short-sighted, it doesn't see into the future. So the Sino-Japanese War takes place, and the reason it's significant is it will put Japan on the map as a military power in Asia, because they will crush the Chinese military. This will be the annexation of Formosa. Now, the European occupation of China is going to really culminate with the Boxers' Rebellion of 1898. Okay, and if you want to, there is, in the early 1960s, there were all these epic movies like The Ten Commandments. Well, there's one called 95 Days in Peking, which goes over the Boxers' Rebellion. It's very good, Charlton Heston, but it's early 1960s, although it is color. I know some people don't like black and white. My stepdaughter's like that. Won't watch anything in black and white. It's too old a movie. I like color. Well, this is color, okay? But what the Boxers' Rebellion refers to is the Boxers were a group, exactly as it sounds, of pugilists, boxers, in China in the early 19th century. Well, by the late 19th century, really by the middle 19th century, they really had kind of stopped being boxers, and they had become a kind of mercenary military force, much like the Blackwater Organization in the United States. They became a private security force. And in reaction to what they deemed to be a corruption of Chinese culture and a corruption of the Chinese political system, they decided to organize themselves together and stage a rebellion against the European powers. And at first, it seemed as though it was going to be successful. The Chinese emperor, actually at this time it was the Chinese empress that was calling the shots. And again, this is another movie that you would want to watch. This one actually won Academy Awards and was much more recent. By much more recent, I mean 1980s. Called The Last Emperor, which, among other things, was Peter O'Toole's swan song. He died shortly after making the movie. I know I watch too many movies and too much television. Okay, everybody tells me that, but that's fine. They're good. It's not a question. TV doesn't necessarily rot your brain. It depends on what you watch. You know, if you watch Jerry Springer and The View, you rot your brain. If you watch things like 95 Days in Peking or The Last Emperor or The Last Samurai, then you actually expand your knowledge and you don't rot your brain. So it all depends. Be careful. There's a reason that they put ratings up there with parental guidance suggested. Okay, so I'm parenting guiding you towards these films. But at any rate, and the Chinese Empress originally backs the Boxers. Okay, and the Boxers seize the European compound in Peking, and they surround it. They besiege it for 95 days. During which time the Europeans land an army in China to march on Peking and get rid of the Boxers, lift the siege. Originally, the Chinese Empress calls out the Chinese military to block the army, hoping that the Boxers will win. But when she sees that the Chinese military is really no match for the European army is a conglomerate force from several of the nations that are involved in China. When she sees that there's really no chance, then the Chinese military will actually join the invading European army and proceed with them marching on the Boxers. The Boxers, as what the story ends with, and you'll see this if you watch the film, what the story ends with is the crushing of the Boxers' rebellion. But while the Boxers' rebellion is crushed, okay, it signals in the end of European domination of China. And the reason for that is because the Europeans come to the conclusion that if this sort of thing is going to happen, then holding on to China is just not cost efficient. And what it always reminds me of is what I refer to as the Great Rebellion of 18. And the Great Rebellion of 18 does not refer to 1918 or 1818. The Great Rebellion of 18 refers to my 18th year on the planet. My brother and I get along with my brother very well now. I love him to death. But when we were kids, we fought constantly the way brothers do. And we had now gotten to the point where we were 18 and 19 years old, respectively, him being a year older than I. And one day, we got a pizza, like people like brothers do. My brother, me, my mom, we were sitting down to a pizza dinner, nice pizza dinner. And my brother started complaining about the pizza. And I said to him, you know what, buddy? I've had it with your complaining. I've had it with all this. I've had it with your 18 years of tyranny over me. Okay? If you don't like the pizza, don't eat the pizza. Okay? And he looked at me and he said, yeah, maybe you'd like to be in the hospital for a little while complaining about some missing teeth. And that was it. I staged my rebellion. I stood to my feet. Okay? I punched him 4 times as hard as I could in the face. And after the 4th punch, I looked at it. And I saw that it really wasn't doing very much damage. My brother is one of these like Bavarian builds, real stocky kind of guy, and mean as a son of a bitch when he needs to be. Okay, like he's put people in the hospital in fights. And I saw him look up at me, and his eyes were real red. And I was like, "Oh crap! I have made a serious tactical error here." And he stood up to his feet, punched me a few times, closed my eye, almost broke my jaw, and that was the end of the rebellion. But from that day to this day, he and I have never fought. We've never actually even had a crossword between us since then. We get along famously. And so sometimes, even when you lose the rebellion, you win. Okay, just a little kind of a personal tangential side. Now, the second of these conflicts, the Russo-Japanese War, is going to be more significant because it's one thing for the Japanese to defeat the Chinese military. It's another thing for them to defeat a European army, that European army being the Russian army. Okay, the Japanese out of this will gain Port Arthur, which is in the Bay of Korea, which the Bay of Korea lies between the Korean Peninsula and mainland China. It's the defeat of Russia. It will also introduce the United States as a diplomatic force. Theodore Roosevelt will actually mediate the armistice that ends this war and will win the Nobel Prize. He'll become the first president to win the Nobel Prize. What all of this culminates with, though, is the Japanese are now on the stage as a military force in Asia and the Pacific. This puts them ultimately in a collision course with the United States. As I said earlier, the United States is attempting to expand its influence across the Pacific into Asia. The Japanese are doing the same thing. This puts them in a collision course. The Europeans, for their part after the Boxer Rebellion, begin to ebb. They begin to withdraw from a lot of their holdings in Asia. They maintain a few of them, but they begin to ebb and withdraw. And remember, 1904, 1905 is the Russo-Japanese War. That's after the Spanish-American War. So the Spanish are out of the Philippines. Okay, they now have very few holdings in Asia. The Dutch still have some down in New Guinea, and the French have some, most notably in Indochina, and the British have some, most notably Singapore, which they'll lose to the Japanese in the early days of the Second World War. 1942, the early days of the European part of the Second World War. Okay. On to Hawaii. As I said, what the United States is attempting to do is create a series of stepping stones across the Pacific Ocean. They've obtained Midway Island. To get to Midway, however, you need a refueling area. That refueling area will be Hawaii. This will also be the time that the United States occupies and takes possession of Guam and American Samoa in the South Pacific. They will ultimately also virtually annex the Philippines. Okay, so you get the idea, and if you look at a map of the Pacific, you'll see what we're talking about here, that you're building a series of stepping stones. With Hawaii, however, there was another interest as well, and that interest was economic, okay? Hawaii is an economy that is based on sugar, okay? Well, remember, we have two things growing. We have the agricultural sector and we have the manufacturing sector, okay? Now, let's look at this chronologically. The first opening to Hawaii, the first American introduction to Hawaii is in 1842. By 1875, the United States begins to integrate Hawaii into its economy. Right? This isn't really going to be as much of a military conquest as it is an economic conquest. They begin to trade with Hawaii. The U.S. being a much larger economic power, they rather rapidly, within about a 10-year period, come to dominate Hawaii economically. Okay, by 1891, the United States concocts a plan for the annexation of Hawaii, ultimately making it one of the U.S. states. That's not till the 1950s that it will actually become a state. The key thing comes in 1890 with the McKinley Tariff Act. What the McKinley Tariff Act is going to do is give exclusive rights to the sugar production for the American Sugar Refining Company. Okay, this locks Hawaii as a U.S. sphere of influence. Okay, the American Sugar Refining Company will take over monopolistic control over the sugar trade in Hawaii. They'll do the same thing in Central America. Okay, as a result of this, the Hawaiian queen at the time, Liliuokalani, feels that this is not in Hawaii's best interest, that Hawaii's best interests are served by having multiple competitive interests in their sugar industry. Okay, most notably Britain, France. Okay, and so she initiates a grassroots populist movement against the United States, hoping, I suppose, that as a result of their commercial sugar interests, Britain and France will intervene on her behalf, which of course they do not do because they do not want to tangle with this emerging power of the United States. And so the United States overthrows her and takes over Hawaii properly. Now, On to Latin America. We talk in U.S. History 1 about the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine has two points to it. Okay, first, that the Americas is closed to European colonization. The second being that the United States will not involve itself in European affairs. The first one is the most important for us. Okay, what the United States establishes with the Monroe Doctrine, which comes out in 1823 rather, is that the Americas, particularly Latin America, is a U.S. sphere of influence. This will begin the American domination of the Western Hemisphere. In my world geography class, when we deal with the Americas, and specifically with North America, what we deal with is, one of the focal points we deal with is the hegemonic influence exerted by the United States, meaning they're the dominant power. The Chilean incident refers to an incident in which two U.S. sailors, there was a U.S. ship docked in Chile, in Santiago, and two U.S. sailors were killed, and the U.S. threatened military invasion as a result of it, and the Chilean government had to pay them an indemnity. Venezuelan intervention, the Venezuelans were attempting to overthrow, well, they were attempting to block American commercial interests from entering into South America, and that was a U.S. Marine intervention. The U.S. Marines moved in, took Cartagena, and suppressed the rebellion. Now we have a competition for markets and inputs with Great Britain. That was really the backdrop of the Venezuelan intervention. And then finally, the United States is going to incite and finance a revolution in Cuba. Now, this is in the mid-1890s. This will be one of the precipitory causes of the Spanish-American War. The Cubans under Jose Marte will begin a kind of an insidious insurgency against the Spanish in Cuba, which ultimately will lead to U.S. intervention and precipitate the Spanish-American War, which we now have, the Spanish-American War, okay? The causes, now this is kind of the strange thing, because what a lot of people misread with the Spanish-American War is they think that a lot of it had to do with Cuba, but oddly enough, Cuba was a secondary concern for the United States. They were confident that the rebellion they had incited would eventually win out. Their concern was more with the continued attempt by the United States to push westward across the Pacific and ultimately into Asia. To do this, as I've said before, they need a series of stepping stones, a series of refueling stations. Well, now they've got Hawaii, and they've got Midway, Guam, American Samoa. That gets them about halfway across. In order to really be able to project the force into China that they might need, or ultimately, even at this early stage, okay, this is the time period of what we just looked at a couple of slides ago, of the Sino-Japanese War. Already we're seeing an aggressive Japanese foreign policy in the Pacific and in Asia. And so the United States might be, it's always kind of odd to me to attribute to the United States such foresight, but they see Japan as a potential competitor. It's always, that's why I'm not a conspiracy theorist anymore. Used to be one of those conspiracy theorists like Mel Gibson in the movie, right? Again, a movie, I know. U.S. history through movies. Good idea for a class, but no. But at any rate, where was I? I lost my train of thought now. Wait a minute. Hold on. Let me get it back here. Yeah. So, but no, I'm not a conspiracy theorist anymore, because to attribute to the American government conspiracies is, I think, to attribute to them much more intelligence and capability than they're capable of. But at any rate, you have two precipitory causes. You have the American expansion into Latin America, okay, especially Cuba. U.S. interest in Cuba dates back all the way to the 1850s. If you remember from U.S. History 1, if you took that, or if you studied history in high school, you learned of something called the Ostend Manifesto. The Ostend Manifesto stipulated that Cuba, being only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, was simply a natural extension of the United States. And it was at that point that the United States started to entertain thoughts of dominating Cuba. Okay? Now, into all of this, you also have that economic crisis which ended Epoch 1, okay, that was the climax of Epoch 1, was this economic crisis that hits in the 1890s, okay? Partially then, in an attempt to alleviate this, the United States wants to press home its push into Asia, which necessitates a final fueling and staging area in the Philippines, in the case force is necessary to project in that direction, and securing Cuba and domination of Latin America in an effort to fuel the American economy and try to get some sort of resurgence. Okay. And this is also the time of yellow journalism. Now, what we mean by that, okay, this is the time of William Randolph Hearst. What we mean by this yellow journalism idea is that the American people were not particularly interested in war. What they were interested in was trying to fix the economy. Remember, the economy in the 1890s falls into the dumper, goes into the crapper, okay? We have the crisis in 1892 and 93. There's no recovery from that. McKinley can't figure anything out to make it recover. And so he concocts this idea of war, but public opinion is tremendously opposed to the Spanish-American War. So what William Randolph Hearst and some of the other newspapers are going to do is create precipitory cause. They're literally just going to make things up that are going to turn the American people against the Spanish to the point that they're going to back war. And it's one of the more interesting things. It's possible to do this in the 1890s. Today, of course, to do such a thing really wouldn't be possible because we've moved beyond the age of spin. Information technology is so available now that it's difficult for the government to control access to information. Well, in this case, the newspapers, the media, and the government of the United States collaborated deliberately and with malice of forethought, collaborated to create precipitory cause for this war. It will happen again. It will happen again in World War I. It will happen again in World War II. Okay? Oh, and the Spanish-American War, by the way, kind of a trivia question. The Spanish-American War is one of 5 wars in U.S. history that Congress has declared. And as a hint to this, well, actually, why don't we do it this way? If you have an answer to the question, this is one of them. Spanish-American War, 1898, is one of 5 wars declared by Congress. What are the other 4 wars that Congress declared? And if you really want to have fun, don't look it up. There are 4 other wars. I will give you this hint. The Civil War is not one of them. Abraham Lincoln never consulted Congress in using military force against the Confederacy. Now, preliminary moves, we looked already at McKinley's expansion, the expansion into Hawaii. The preliminary idea is already the United States is starting to think, and again, this is to protect and project towards Asia, their interests in Asia, that it's becoming more and more difficult to go around Cape Horn. Cape Horn lies at the bottom of South America. It becomes more and more logistically difficult to project force. That's an awful long supply line. In the event of trouble in Asia, particularly trouble with Japan, that's a very long supply line to have to maintain. It would be much better to blow through Central America with a canal and create a shortcut. Okay, originally they plan on doing this through Nicaragua. There are a lot of logistical problems to this, which we won't get into, most notably that it's just too wide to do. Now, 1897, the Spanish seek terms with the Cuban revolutionaries. This does not play to U.S. interests. What the Spanish offer, okay, and they kind of, and the reason they do this is because they kind of see trouble with the United States brewing. In an effort to prevent that from happening, they want to pacify Cuba. To pacify Cuba, they offer the Cuban revolutionaries partial autonomy. This does not serve U.S. interests. What the U.S. wants is the domination of Cuba. Okay? If the Cuban rebels are given partial autonomy, the U.S. can't really go under the guise of giving them assistance, and then ultimately take over. They would have to do more of a bald-faced military invasion of Cuba, which they don't want to do if they don't have to. And so the final tipping point is going to be the Maine incident. The Maine is a U.S. ship in Havana Harbor that mysteriously explodes and kills 260 Marines. Okay? The Spanish are blamed for this. There is actually no empirical evidence historically that ties the Spanish to the detonation of the explosives on the Maine. In point of fact, what the Maine was doing in Havana Harbor is the Maine was loaded down with munitions for the Cuban rebels. Okay? And what historically there's kind of a debate on it, but the consensual opinion is that it was just simply an accident. A loose spark in the Maine ignited the powder and blew up the Maine. In March of 1898, the United States will issue an ultimatum to Spain, demanding an armistice between Spain and the rebels, an end to the reconcentration of Spanish holdings in Latin America, acceptance of U.S. arbitration in the situation in Cuba, and Spain will concede these first 2 points. On 11 April, McKinley makes a rousing speech to Congress in which he condemns Spain and Spain's prosecution of the war and their use of extra-legal tactics against the guerrillas, and will appeal to Congress's sympathies for the Cuban revolutionaries and ultimately ask for a declaration of war. You see, Congress will declare war on the 25th of April. And attached to this, however, Congress will put in what's known as the Teller Amendment. The United States wants, when it goes into Cuba, to have the rebels on its side. Okay? And so in an effort to placate them, because the rebels are concerned, if you allow the United States in, you are substituting the Spanish domination for U.S. domination. So in an effort to prevent that from their thinking that way, in an effort to placate them with that, the Teller Amendment will be passed, which says that the United States has no intention of annexing Cuba. They're going down there, the United States is going down there out of the goodness of their heart, simply to help free the Cuban revolutionaries, and for commercial interests. In point of fact, this is obviously not true. What we'll have later on, we'll have the Platt Amendment passed. And the Platt Amendment, well, we'll get to that when we get to it in just a second. That was a phone, what you heard there was a phone call from my wife. My wife is in Montana with my stepdaughter for the next 2 months. She's down there. My stepdaughter's due. She's having another baby. And she's moving into a new house. She just got redeployed there. She just got restationed there from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. Yeah, they moved her. Think about that. Just think about that for a minute. Take a little break here and just think about that for a minute, right? She was at Barksdale Air Force Base for 6 years. Barksdale Air Force Base is in Shreveport, Louisiana. Hell on earth. 100 degrees in the summertime. Okay? No snow. Right? They restationed her to Great Falls, Montana. On the Canadian border. Well, at any rate. Okay. Now, the course of the war. In the Philippines, 1 May 1898, the destruction of the Spanish fleet in Manila. U.S. troops are ordered to the Philippines and will land in the early summer and will suppress Spanish resistance very quickly. With the assistance of the Filipinos. The Filipinos rise up against the Spanish and support the American invasion. Cuba is just an absolute mess for the United States military to go into. There is a general lack of preparedness on the part of the United States. Logistically, the entire operation is tremendously mismanaged. As you see there, 5,000 troops will be killed. Only 379 of them in combat. The rest of them will die of disease, mostly malaria. And that's as a result of a lack of logistical support. This is when Theodore Roosevelt makes his famous storm up San Juan Hill, with the Rough Riders and suppresses the last of the Spanish resistance. On 3 July, there will be the destruction of the Spanish fleet, and in August of 1898, things all over. So the thing starts. Congress declares war in April of 1898, and by August of 1898, the war is over. The Spanish have lost. They'll cede the Philippines. They'll surrender their holdings in the Philippines and in Cuba. This will be the Treaty of Paris. It will be the acceptance of Cuban independence. They'll cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S. This is when the United States will come into possession of Guam. Guam being in the South Pacific, this will represent another of those stepping stones I've been talking about, another refueling station for the projection of U.S. commercial interests and force into mainland Asia. The American occupation of Manila, and the Americans will remain in Manila until the Japanese boot them out in 1942, and then after that, the United States will come back and boot the Japanese out, and then finally, in 6 February 1899, the treaty will be ratified by the U.S. Senate. This boots the Spanish out of Latin America for the last and final time. The United States now will dominate Cuba. The United States will dominate the Philippines. They'll have more staging areas in the Pacific. And the other thing that we talk about is in my world geography classes, this initiates the rise of U.S. hegemony. From this point forward, 1898 forward, there will not be until 1959 a single incident in the Americas where American interests do not win out. The United States will win every contest in the Americas from 1898 to 1959. That's why this is the rising tide of the American empire. That's why we start. Okay, I was rudely interrupted by the telephone. Hopefully I'll stop receiving phone calls. I should just pull all the plugs on my phones. You know what I can do is I can turn my cell phone off. I should have done that in advance, right? But anyways, here we are. The United States has just successfully defeated the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. The problem is that the Filipino people envisioned themselves being made an independent nation after the Spanish left. This is not going to be the case, as we've stipulated many times. The United States is looking for a final staging area to get onto the Asian mainland and to help control U.S. interests in the Pacific. This will be the Philippines. And so when Spanish independence, when independence from Spain comes, which is in the late summer of 1898, by the wintertime, it's apparent that the United States does not intend on leaving. And so they will begin an insurgency against the United States. And this will become one of the great insurgent wars of American history. This will be the first real American insurgent war, other than the Indian Wars. And so the United States is going to adopt the Spanish tactics in fighting the insurgents, which you see here Mao's analogy of emptying the sea. The problem with an insurgency, okay, and we're going to deal with this again as we go through U.S. history, particularly in the Vietnam conflict and in the current conflict with the radical elements of the fundamentalist movement. It's difficult to differentiate between civilian population and military population. The insurgents don't always wear clearly definable insignias and military uniforms, etc. And so it's difficult to tell the difference between the two. Mao develops a strategy for combating insurgencies, which he refers to as emptying the sea. Okay? If you imagine a sea full of fish, you don't know which fish are friend and which fish are foe. And so what you do is you simply drain the sea of water. Then all of the fish die. And so the United States will engage in a war of attrition against the Spanish population. The United States will burn down entire Filipino villages. Okay? They will, in fact, as you see here, establish concentration camps. They will isolate the Filipino population, okay, and then concentrate them in small, controlled areas. During the war, 200,000 Filipinos will die from disease and starvation. This is emptying the sea. Okay, break the resistance is what the United States strategy is, and so it's one of those darker periods in U.S. history in fighting an insurgency. Now, turning to Latin America, we have now the development after the Spanish-American War of the Roosevelt Corollary. We talked about the Monroe Doctrine a couple of times. The Monroe Doctrine is the first statement, a declaratory statement on U.S. foreign policy in American history. That's from 1823. The Roosevelt Corollary is not really a doctrinaire statement by the United States. It is intended as a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So it simply adds more substance to the Monroe Doctrine. It initiates what famously is referred to as gunboat diplomacy. Okay, and what it stipulates is the use of U.S. military force to support U.S. interests in Latin America, most notably business interests. And so this is going to initiate a series, an era over the next 20 years of U.S. military interventions in Central America and South America, all of which are in pursuit of U.S. business interests. Okay? The principal business interests are going to be the American Sugar Refining Company, the DuPont Fruit Company, and a series of banks who lend out money. The United States effectively becomes the financier and chief creditor of all of Latin America, Central America, Cuba, the Caribbean, okay? And so when they are unable to pay their loans back, Theodore Roosevelt is going to order in the Marines, and that's gunboat diplomacy. There will be, after the Spanish-American War, as you see there, in excess of 20 U.S. military interventions in Latin America. Some of the more famous ones we'll go over. In 1900, the United States will establish a pro-U.S. government in Puerto Rico. This will be the first of them. They'll also establish pro-U.S. governments in Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, and elsewhere. Okay, Puerto Rico will ultimately be annexed as a U.S. territory. And then you see the two, the American Sugar Refining Company and the United Fruit Company, which will actually ultimately become DuPont Fruit. Now, in Cuba, remember that we discussed after the Spanish withdrawal from Cuba and the defeat in the Spanish-American War of Spanish forces, we had talked when Congress declared war in April of 1898, we talked of the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment assured the Cuban population, particularly those who had risen up in support of the U.S. against the Spanish, that the U.S. had no intention whatsoever of dominating Cuba, that Cuba would become an independent republic. The Platt Amendment is going to contradict this, okay? The Platt Amendment stipulates the recognition of U.S. domination over Cuba, a restriction of Cuban foreign policy. Cuba will not be permitted to pursue its own foreign policy. They will have to pursue a foreign policy that is consistent with the United States. The United States will seize control over the Cuban monetary and fiscal policies. Okay, in other words, the United States will become the bankers of Cuba, and they will also control both taxation and spending. This severely limits Cuban sovereignty. Okay, they require Cuba to lease a naval base to the United States, the very famous naval base at Guantanamo Bay. This is the time. And it's pursuant to this Platt Amendment, this is the time that the United States will begin its occupation of the Guantanamo Bay naval base. It authorizes U.S. intervention to maintain U.S. interests in Cuba. And now, the interesting thing is that it will also give the United States control over Cuban trade policy. And here we have one of the more interesting contradictions in U.S. foreign policy during this period. At the same time, the United States is trying to argue with the European powers into allowing the United States to have free trade in Asia, specifically China. The United States prohibits the Europeans from having free trade in Latin America and specifically in Cuba. Okay, and so it's a contradiction. If you entertain the idea that the Europeans should allow free trade in China, then you have to entertain the idea that you're going to allow free trade in Cuba and Latin America. But again, we see this contradiction. Okay. The development of the Panama Canal. Okay, they originally, remember what we said earlier, they originally intended on it going through Guatemala. They decide that that is logistically unfeasible. Panama is a much more logistically feasible area to build the canal. They're still committed to building the canal. It's Theodore Roosevelt that's going to actually initiate the construction of it. However, Panama at this time, the Panamanian Isthmus, is owned by Colombia, which is an independent kingdom. The U.S. at first offers to purchase the area from Colombia, but Colombia refuses. Okay? After the refusal by Colombia to sell Panama to the United States, or to sell at least the canal zone to the United States incites a rebellion against Colombia in Panama, okay, and gives them military assistance and advice, and actually troops on the ground to help stage the coup against Colombia that will throw out Colombia from Panama. Panama then becomes an independent country. The United States instills a government that is pro-U.S. That government then leases the canal area to the United States, and the United States begins to build the Panama Canal. That's all in 1903. Now, we had discussed in the preceding lecture the demise of the Roosevelt administration for a variety of reasons that we don't have to get into now. Okay, basically this split in the party between the conservatives and progressives. As a result, we have Taft stepping in. Taft is going to pursue a slightly different tact in foreign policy from Theodore Roosevelt. Rather than gunboat diplomacy, we're going to use dollar diplomacy. Okay, the United States will use its economic power to dominate Latin America and Central America rather than the more overt use of military force. If you control their purse strings, you can control their behavior. Okay? It's a good enough idea, but we want to keep in the back of our minds that the U.S. economy really is not back on firm ground. Okay? So it's ultimately not going to be terribly successful. And the United States will therefore have to resort to military force again. You see the intervention in Nicaragua, first in 1909, that's under Taft, and again in 1912, under Taft. Finally, somewhat later, and we'll discuss it again a little bit, is in 1932, the United States will make its third military intervention into Nicaragua and establish the Somoza government, which is ultimately overthrown, and we'll deal with this in Epoch 3, is overthrown by the Sandinistas in 1979. Additional interventions will take place in Costa Rica, Cuba, Dominican Republic. You see them listed there. Okay, virtually every Central American country witnesses direct U.S. military intervention from the United States Marines. Okay, Wilson now takes over after the demise of Taft, which we talked about in the previous lecture. Because of the party split, the progressives divide themselves between the Democratic Party and the Bull Moose Party of Theodore Roosevelt, leaving Taft with this small core of conservatives, which isn't sufficient to win him the election. And so Wilson will come into the White House in 1912. Well, he'll win the election in 1912, enter the White House in 1913. He will continue in Roosevelt's tradition and in Taft's tradition with military interventions in the Western Hemisphere. 1915, we'll have U.S. troops in Haiti. 1919, we'll have the suppression of a Haitian rebellion. 1916, the introduction of U.S. troops into the Dominican Republic. 1917, they'll enter Cuba to put, as pursuant to the Platt Amendment, to put down a rebellion there. Then we have his more famous interventions in Mexico. And without getting in too deeply to Mexican politics, in 1913, a populist government under Huerta, stages a coup against the military dictatorship in Mexico. Okay? At first, the United States looks kindly upon this. Okay, they figure, oh, okay, this will form a democracy. They'll become allies of the United States in the region. That doesn't really materialize. The new Mexican regime is fairly critical of all of the U.S. interventions taking place in Latin America. So as a result of this, the United States will use as a precipitory cause the failure by Mexico to repay loans to the United States to occupy the city of Veracruz on the Gulf Coast. They will then use as a precipitory cause for a full-scale intervention into Mexico the very famous Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa is effectively an outlaw. He's a bandit that roams the Mexican countryside, and he's a bandit. Well, he makes cross-border raids into the United States. The U.S. government goes to the Huerta government and complains about this, and finally comes to the conclusion that the Huerta government has no intention or capacity to stop Pancho Villa from doing this. So the U.S. uses this as a precipitory cause to launch a full-scale military intervention into Mexico. In 1917, these forces will be withdrawn, and they will come to an agreement with the Huerta government that basically puts Mexico not really as a client state of the United States, but much more in the U.S. sphere of influence. Now, finally, the conclusion. What we've seen here is, first of all, as I said at the outset, and as I've said before, we are dispelling this myth of U.S. isolationism through the 19th century. Okay? The Monroe Doctrine, people often misconstrue this. They think the Monroe Doctrine is a declaration by the United States to be neutral and to be isolationistic. That's not the case. What the Monroe Doctrine does is stipulate that the U.S. carves out the Western Hemisphere as a U.S. sphere of influence. This will initiate a series of aggressive foreign policy actions on the part of the United States in Latin America and Central America. Okay? We also have, of course, and that's why you see there it says aggressive interventionist foreign policy in support of U.S. business interests and expansion of U.S. manufacturing sector. That counts both for the Western Hemisphere and across the Pacific Ocean. As I mentioned earlier, the Pacific policy of expansion into the South Pacific with Guam, the American Samoa, Hawaii, Midway Island, and the Philippines, and the intention ultimately to press U.S. business interests over into China, puts the United States in a collision course with Japan, who is at the same time expanding their strategic interests in Asia. So the two are on a collision course, and this is as of really the United States and the Japanese get into a collision course by the first decade of the 20th century. And this will mature over the next 10 or 15 years, and by the 1930s, war between Japan and the United States becomes inevitable. Okay? And then finally, we see U.S. hegemony. I made reference to this, U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, 1898 to 1959, and we don't want to misconstrue that. We'll talk about it later in Epoch 3. What we mean by that is not that after 1959, the United States is not a dominant player in the Western Hemisphere. It remains a dominant player in the Western Hemisphere to date. What we mean is it has to do with the definition of hegemony itself. From 1898 to 1959, there is not a single incident of the U.S. not successfully pressing its interests in the Western Hemisphere. From 1959 to date, we see several incidents where the United States doesn't win. Okay? For hegemony means that you're so dominant that there isn't a single incident that you don't win. Okay? And so we'll be at a point, and that's why we really start to talk at that point in Epoch 3, we'll really start to talk about the decline of the American Empire. And that's one of the things in essay number 2, and I still haven't assigned the essays, I got to do that this week. But in essay 2, the subject of essay 2 is, what evidence do we have of the declining American empire? Well, this diminution of its position in the Western Hemisphere is one of those examples. And we'll get into that in much more detail in Epoch 3. But I think because this says conclusion, I should put conclusion at the end of every one of these. This concludes 2.2.